Hello and welcome to Africa Today. I am Esther Makmariola. Largely viewed from a global perspective with unbelievable assumptions and degrading stereotypes, Africa is often portrayed in a negative light where potential game changers like tourism and hospitality rarely make it among top stories on the news bulletin. For those yet to find out for themselves, Africa is home to a wealth of archaeological sites, historic monuments, beautiful coastlines and breathtaking landscapes as mountains, waterfalls, lush vegetations and wildlife help to connect the dots and fill up the spaces of nature. And so we ask, what are your thoughts on the challenges and potentials for tourism in Africa as the international community marks World Tourism Day? You can join the conversation and share your thoughts with us on Twitter at TVC News NG. We take a report and Africa Today will continue. Welcome on board.
South Africa is said to be one of the most beautiful countries in the world, owing to its natural landscape. Since the fall of apartheid in 1994, more visitors are discovering her changing and breathtaking scenery. South Africa's scenic beauty, magnificent outdoors, and cultural diversity have made it to one of the world's fastest growing leisure and business travels destinations in the world. Despite tough global economic conditions, tourism grew in 2011 with 8.3 million international tourists and has continued to make a record-breaking growth. The country has earmarked tourism as a key sector with excellent potential for growth as the government aims to increase tourism's contribution, both direct and indirectly, from the 2009 baseline of 189.4 billion rand, that's $11 billion, and 7.9% of GDP, to 499 billion rand. Tourism also supports 1 in every 12 jobs in South Africa. The regional African tourist market is very crucial to South Africa, contributing more than 73% of total tourist arrivals and more than 50 billion rand in revenue. Domestic tourism is also an important source of revenue and employment, contributing 52% of total tourism consumption. Cruise and rural tourism are focus growth areas. A labor-intensive sector with a supply chain that links across sectors, tourism is a priority sector in the government's planning and policy frameworks. It is one of the 6 job drivers of the new Growth Path framework. With its first world infrastructure, soothing climate and breathtaking scenery, a virtual app will even take you closer to that destination.
In the last 6 decades, the tourism sector has evolved to become one of the fastest growing and most important economic sectors benefiting destinations and communities worldwide. Today, tourism represents an estimated 10% of the world's GDP, which amounts to 1 in every 10 jobs, plus a goldmine of prospects and potentials Africa is yet to maximize. Joining me in the studio on Africa Today, I have Ifeoma Beru, a historian and a scholar based in Lagos, Nigeria. And on Skype, I have Marina Novelli, Professor of Tourism and International Development, University of Brighton in the UK. Good to have you both on the program.
Thank you.
Now let's begin with you, Ifeoma Beru. What are your thoughts on how tourism has evolved over the years in Africa today?
Well, I would say the sector hasn't been encouraging, down here on the continent. Unfortunately, we are yet to appreciate the dividends of tourism. And you see, that in itself is not accidental. Because unfortunately, you and I, we are living in a continent where we don't pay attention to our historical legacies. We don't pay our attention to our historical achievements. So whenever you live in a society where the knowledge of history is not being appreciated, you cannot but get all of these dividends, because the truth is that tourism is synonymous to appreciation of cultural heritage. As a matter of fact, the fastest growing sector of the tourism itself is the cultural segment of tourism. More money going into cultural aspect of tourism than any other form of tourism, because you have business tourism, you have medication tourism, you have medical tourism, and all sorts of other forms of tourism. But people get to spend money to cultural visitation more than any other segment of tourism. But right on this continent, you would see that this continent is blessed with all of these dividends in terms of cultural achievement, cultural, historical buildings, heritage, and all sorts of things. But we really do not have government going into the sponsorship of all of these things. Are
you saying all African countries or some African countries? Because right now there are some African countries that make the top 5. You have Egypt, you have Morocco, you have South Africa that make the top 5 countries in Africa that are more of a tourist destination. So
I would say a chunk of African countries, really. Okay. And you see that of Egypt is exceptional, because historically Egypt had been a country blessed with several historical monuments. Yeah. So you cannot speak about cultural heritage without not first referencing Egypt. But I'm saying chunk of countries we have in Africa today do not pay attention to all of our cultural heritage, our cultural sites and what have you. Clearly because they do not see the nexus. The nexus hits us with economic growth and development. And I hope that there will come a time where we'll be able to place culture within the context of economic growth and development.
All right, let me quickly come to you, Mary. Now, from your years of experience and research, how well is tourism playing a vital role in the socio-economic development of communities in sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, in sub-Saharan Africa, tourism, there has been a long history of viewing it as a powerful vehicle for achieving economic growth, job creation, poverty reduction, and Sustainable Development Goals, which obviously highlight this in 3 of the 17 goals, with tourism being actually mentioned, is certainly on the agenda of many governments and many private sector operators. Indeed, though, achieving those goals is not necessarily easy and requires the realization and implementation of appropriate policies and planning mechanism. And indeed, investment in infrastructures such as water, alternative electricity sources, and indeed, the bottom line is that there is a long way to go. However, for most South African countries, it has only been in the last two decades that the development of sustainable and achievable context-specific policies and planning have actually had an effect and have gone beyond aspirational targets, what obviously you were highlighting in the previous conversation. But the real issue is that tourism policy and plans need to reflect the overall national development planning priorities. And what has happened for many years in many African destinations, there has been a lack of cohesiveness between a wish list of what government would like to achieve through tourism and the inclusive growth process that is required in order to make tourism more sustainable.
And what are those factors, would you say, contribute to the, low patronage of, tourist destinations in some part of Africa?
Can you say that again? Sorry, I couldn't
What would
hear
you
very
say
well.
Contributes to the low patronage of tourist destinations in Africa?
Well, I think it's a lack of recognition of the value of tourism. And I'll tell you one thing, one of the studies I've been looking at recently is the fact that for many years tourism in Africa has been targeting primarily international tourists. But one of the main failure that I find very often is that there is not sufficient value given to interregional tourism, for instance. In fact, if you look at the United Nations World Tourism Organization estimates that there are estimates that look at absolute terms, there are about 58 million international tourists arriving in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. for the year 2016, but there were 4 million more arrivals in 2016 compared to 2015. So obviously there is an increase, which is about 5%. But one of the things which is not necessarily recognized is the value of how much intra-regional tourists are. In fact, some of the recent statistic released by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development states that 4 out of 10 international tourists in Africa originate from Africa. So this could include both people traveling within Africa or diaspora tourists. And in Northern Africa, 2 out of 10 international tourists originate from Africa, while in Sub-Saharan Africa, 2 out of 3. So in essence, one of the things is that the product and the variety of policy and plans are very often looking at the traditional markets like the European market, the American market, and increasingly, more recently, the Asian one. So effectively, I think one of the challenges is how do you shift from looking primarily on traditional markets and diversify that portfolio.
All right.
And also earlier it was mentioned that one of the greatest aspect is looking at the cultural heritage of the African continent, which indeed is one of the fundamental aspects of tourism in Africa. But let's not forget that one of the reasons why people do travel primarily to Sub-Saharan Africa is for the safari product. So how do you integrate those two products, the biodiversity, the wildlife, and the culture, is one of the things that maybe we should be looking into.
All right, let's hold your thoughts for now. We need to go on a very quick break. You're watching Africa Today, and we've been looking at the challenges and tourism potentials in Africa as we celebrate World Tourism Day. Welcome back. Besides poor infrastructure, insecurity has been identified as a major threat to the growth of tourism on the continent, especially in North Africa, Mali, and the coastal regions of Kenya. Recently, a group of elderly Dutch tourists were robbed in South Africa by men posing as members of the country's police force. Ifama Beru, how worrying is this development, seeing that tourism, which holds a key as a source of revenue, is also under threat?
That's correct. I think it's clearly because we are yet to resolve the question of insecurity. And you would see that for some countries that it appears that tourism, the industry has been helpful in terms of bringing about economic growth and development for them. They have been able to answer the question of insecurity. You see, you cannot have a chunk of people from the outer world coming down to your country and their lives are at risk. That cannot clearly work out well. Yeah. But you see, right on this continent, we're battling with the question of insecurity. So this seems to be one of the growing factors that seems to be affecting the industry. The industry has got to rise from what it is right now. But for it to rise, we must also give answer to the question of insecurity. But you see, that is not accidental, because I always place all of these things within the right context in which they have got to be. You see, insecurity itself is a reflection of the fact that right on this continent we are yet to value human lives. You see now, so chunks of people out there, they really do not want to come to this continent. They really do not want to visit our cultural heritage. They really do not want to join our festivals because their lives are at risk. And their lives are at risk because those in power are yet to understand that we must necessarily value lives of the people that live within their respective countries. The value for lives would bring about that transformation, because the moment you value the life of your citizen, people have to resolve the question of insecurity. And you would see that for some countries that it appears that tourism, the industry has been helpful in terms of bringing about economic growth and development for them. They have been able to answer the question of insecurity. You see, you cannot have a chunk of people from the outer world coming down to your country and their lives are at risk. That cannot clearly work out well. Yeah. But you see, right on this continent, we're battling with the question of insecurity. So this seems to be one of the growing factors that seems to be affecting the industry. The industry has got to rise from what it is right now. But for it to rise, we must also give answer to the question of insecurity. But you see, that is not accidental, because I always place all of these things within the right context in which they have got to be. You see, insecurity itself is a reflection of the fact that right on this continent we are yet to value human lives. You see now, so chunks of people out there, they really do not want to come to this continent. They really do not want to visit our, cultural heritage. They really do not want to join our festivals because their lives are at risk. And their lives are at risk because, those in power are yet to understand that we must necessarily value, lives of the people that live within, within our respective countries. The value for lives would bring about that transformation, because the moment you value, the life of your citizen, people out there will be able to respect you. People out there will be able to understand the fact that whenever they come to your country, their lives are not at risk.
Indeed. Now, let me quickly come to you, Marina. Earlier on, you mentioned something about policies and planning mechanism, which contribute in one way or the other to the growth of the tourism industry. Now, could you explain for us exactly in detail what are you looking at in terms of policies and planning mechanisms?
Well, since security was actually mentioned, and I would like to make a little point in relation to the generalization effect that often is made following certain events like the one you have just mentioned. I would be very cautious in extending the risk to the entire continent, because I can tell you there are countries in the continent, in Africa, where I travel much more freely and go out at night, much more than I would do actually in London. So going back to your question, policy could be actually looking at ways to implement secure systems which are more effective in those destinations where obviously there is risk for tourists. Then obviously policy to do with the preservation of culture and biodiversity, policies to do with how do you in a way encourage and increase tourism benefit beyond the statistics, because if you speak to any minister of tourism or tourism board across the continent, you will see that their way of measuring the success in tourism is how many tourists are we able to attract. But the reality is that it would be very important to look at policies that would look beyond that into an all-inclusive process of growth, which is grounded possibly into place-based community agency and resilience. And what I mean by community agency and resilience is creating that self-sufficiency and economic benefit that would stay in the locality, so that in the system in which we operate tourism, there is more responsibility both on the part of those that actually offer the tourism product, but also on those that consume the tourism product.
All right, let me quickly come to you, Farmer Berry. If you're talking about tourism destinations, which country readily comes to your mind, aside from, like, well, let me say the country Nigeria?
Of course, Egypt. But before I go into that, I think my earlier statement in regards to the state of insecurity in Africa, just like Professor did say that she wouldn't agree with that in itself. I mean, the generalization in it. You see, we are not trying to paint our continent in the bad light that it's insecure and all of that for the outside world. But the single fact remains that we are yet to resolve the question of insecurity, and it's across the continent. We are not trying to overgeneralize that in itself. The single fact remains that there are some, I mean, a chunk of countries right on this continent that you cannot really walk at whatever point in time, during the day or the night and what have you, for fear of your life. That's a reality that we have got, that government in Africa have got to confront and have got to find, answers to. Egypt, of course.
Egypt so why remains, Egypt?
Of course, because of the historical, several historical sites that you have in Egypt, the pyramids. I mean, these are great sites to behold. And of course, one of the things we have got to also put to the front of our people is that the pyramids and all of those things are clearly of, dividends of black civilization, not the Arabs that seems to appear, appears to be right on there, in that country right now. So Egypt remains a classical example of the wealth you can make out of, tourism, in terms of the historical sites, the great pyramids pyramids that have existed for several centuries and what have you. So to me, I think Egypt.
Egypt. Marina, you as well. What is your favorite destination in Africa?
I've got a long list, and
we can hear them all.
every and each one for different reasons.
Okay.
Obviously, I've worked in over 20 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. I don't know. I've never actually been to Northern Africa, but I would say for different reasons, I've got the Gambia, Kenya, Namibia, Rwanda, Uganda, Sierra Leone. Now Zimbabwe, where I've never been before, and obviously I'm to discover this country. And places which I've visited in the past, like Botswana, South Africa, Tanzania, Ethiopia, and countries like Sierra Leone and Cape Verde, which have got biodiversity which is very much undiscovered. So okay. I would say, to me, every single country in Africa has got a unique and individual reason to be visited. The first time I came to Africa was in 2004. I traveled throughout Namibia with one of my former students, and I was fascinated by the variety of cultures in one particular country. So in each and every country I've been to, I've been in over 20 countries. There has been one more unique reasons to visit and come back again.
What is those unique reasons that make you want to come back?
I think is certainly the biodiversity and the natural environment, which I come from Italy originally and live in the UK. We don't have obviously the diversity that the continent has to offer. I would say the cultural variety as well. And the languages, the food, everything that you can find in each and every country.
Indeed, I quite share your thoughts as well, Marina. But let me come to you, Ifeoma Berry. What would it take for tourism in Africa to be sustainable, going by the tourism, the theme for this year's World Tourism Day, which says sustainable tourism as a tool for development? What would it take to make tourism in Africa that's sustainable? I
think the first has got to do with the appreciation of our cultural heritage. You see, that aspect, that segment of the industry of tourism remains the most significant, but unfortunately we don't have that acceptability of our cultural heritage in terms of we don't have them being recognized in the policies of our government and what have you. As a matter of fact, recently some set of buildings, the popular Brazilian buildings at the Highland, were being demolished by the Lagos State government. This is unfair, because this is, of course, a historical site that one would have thought would be maintained, will be preserved for the masses of our people to see, and of course for outsiders to visit and what have you. So it is clearly about appreciation of our cultural heritage. By so doing, you will be able to come up with all of these works, we'll be able to come up with all of these policies that will enhance, tourism. Clearly, that's to do with appreciation of our culture. But you see, the appreciation of our cultural heritage in this part of the world is not what it is, because we have refused to study history. We have refused to appreciate historical knowledge.
So we should go back to history.
Absolutely, we have got to. Because by so doing, you will be able to understand where you come from, and you'll be able to understand those things that were good about the past that you need to preserve for us to see, for us to know of,
All right. Marina, now, what are your thoughts on that in terms of what I just asked Ifeoma Berry?
To follow on what has been said, I would add to that, certainly the promotion of the empowerment of local communities, and this can only be done through obviously a process of capacity building and cross-cultural understanding, because the site my colleague mentioned earlier, I assume is the Badagry site. I actually did an assessment probably about 8 years ago, and the amount of heritage sites and heritage tools were absolutely unique, and yet they were just preserved in private housing. So again, even when it comes to the understanding of the value of heritage or biodiversity, if that matters, there are countries in Africa which are fighting against poaching, which are fighting against the depletion of certain particular species. If there aren't the people of Africa which become the custodian of those valuable assets. It's very difficult actually that this can be used for tourism or for anything else. So I suppose the protection and preservation of what is available needs to start from the people of Africa first.
Indeed.
And the only way to do this, as I must agree, is a process of understanding of what is the potential of those things.
Indeed.
And as we say in our field, to make sure we don't kill the goose that lay the golden egg of tourism, because at the end of the day, the reason why people come to certain countries is because these are unique features not available elsewhere.
Yes, and we definitely hope that such unique features will not go extinct, and we will continue to sell our continent as a tourist destination anytime, any day. Thanks a lot, Marina Novelli, Professor of Tourism and International Development, University of Brighton in the UK. It's a pleasure always to have your thoughts with us on Africa Today. And I'd like to thank you, Fama Beru, historian and scholar based in Lagos.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
At a point in time when Africa needs to diversify her sources to boost resources, tourism holds a great potential for nations to close the gap on inequality and eradicate poverty. Consolidating on the continent's rich cultural heritage and natural beauty means the tourism sector must be sustainable enough to kickstart the next phase of socio-economic development. And that is our package for today. But don't forget to join the conversation as usual on Twitter at TVC News NG. And also follow me for updates around Africa at Esther TVC News. Until the next one, I am Esther Mokwariola. And always remember, change starts with you.